Who are you? Her voice trembled, barely audible, but it sliced through the quiet din of the restaurant like shattered glass. The man sitting at the table didn't answer immediately. He just stared at her, not in the way strangers do, but as if he recognized something deep in her, like he had seen a ghost from a life he thought long buried. His fingers curled instinctively around the silver ring on his left hand, the one with the swirling pattern she had seen in her mother's jewelry box her entire life. A chill, colder than the snowstorm raging outside, raced down her spine. Why did he flinch when I mentioned my mother's name? Why does he look at me like that? Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and Hannah Brooks was about to discover a truth that would change her life forever. Chapter 1. Winter's Grip. In the shadow of Syracuse, New York, where winters bite harder than they should and summers barely offer relief, survival wasn't guaranteed, especially for people like Hannah. She worked at the Argent, a luxury restaurant that clung to the edge of downtown like a polished gem in a cracked crown. Its gleaming glass walls reflected the glow of the city's tallest buildings, and inside, the air always smelled faintly of truffle oil and silent ambition. Hannah Brooks was a 24-year-old waitress with tired, sea-green eyes and a smile that had known more storms than sunshine. Life had chipped away at her, but it hadn't broken her. She was poor, fiercely hardworking, and kind in the sort of way that made people feel less invisible. She didn't wear that black uniform for glamour or a shot at big tips. She wore it because it paid for her mother's growing stack of medical bills. Her mother, Margaret Brooks, had been battling lung cancer for 2 years. The treatments had drained everything they had. Now they lived in a sagging 2-bedroom house on the south side of the city. The roof leaked when it rained, and the ancient heating system coughed more than it warmed. Hannah had dropped out of college to care for her mother. She traded textbooks for trays, dreams for reality. Every night she came home with aching feet, counting the few crumpled bills in her apron and whispering to herself, just one more shift, one more week. Kindness was her armor. Her work ethic was her shield. Chapter 2. The Stranger. It was an ordinary Tuesday in March 2025, or so she thought. The Argent was alive with its usual crowd. Executives flashing watches worth more than Hannah's entire yearly income. Couples showing off diamond necklaces under soft candlelight, and whispered conversations about IPOs and mergers that had nothing to do with people like her. She moved among them like a shadow, efficient, unnoticed, but always watching. Then he walked in. He came alone, middle-aged, maybe 50. His hair was streaked with silver, his posture controlled and confident. His tailored charcoal gray coat suggested wealth, but it was his presence that made the room take notice. A quiet authority rippled through the air, parting conversations as if he carried some invisible weight no one dared challenge. Hannah didn't recognize him, but something inside her shifted. She grabbed a menu, smoothed her apron, and approached his table by the window. Outside, the snow swirled in tight spirals, as if the storm had chosen that moment to dance just for them. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Argent," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion humming beneath her skin. "What can I get started for you?" The man's gaze lifted to hers. His eyes were gray, stormy, sharp but distant. He studied her a moment too long. Then he ordered a dry martini and the chef's special, lobster ravioli with white truffle butter. As he spoke, Hannah's gaze dropped briefly to his left hand. There it was, a silver ring, simple, elegant, etched with a swirling design that caught the light when he moved. Her breath hitched. She knew that pattern. She had seen it on her mother's engagement ring, the one Margaret kept tucked away in a small velvet box, hidden in her dresser drawer at home. Coincidence. Just coincidence, she told herself. She scribbled his order and retreated to the kitchen. But her pulse raced, and her hands trembled. Chapter 3. Unraveling. When Hannah returned with his meal, she found him staring out the window, lost in thought. She placed the plate gently in front of him. "Here you go, sir." He turned his head slowly, and something flickered behind his expression. Surprise, maybe caution. "Thank you," he said softly. She hesitated. The question pressed against her lips until it broke free. "May I ask you something?" He set his fork down. Of course. That ring. She nodded toward his hand, trying to sound casual, though her heart hammered against her ribs. It's beautiful. My mom has one just like it. It was her engagement ring. Where did you get it? He froze. It was brief, barely a second, but Hannah caught it. The way his breath faltered, the fork paused midair, the look that darkened his eyes. It's an old piece, he said, his tone tightly controlled. Custom made. What's your mom's name? He asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. Hannah's stomach tightened. Margaret. Margaret Brooks. For a moment, he didn't breathe. His eyes locked on hers, searching for something. Then they dropped to his plate. His fingers tightened around his napkin until the knuckles blanched. That's a nice name, he murmured. The air thickened between them. May I send you something? He asked abruptly. As a thank you for the service tonight. Hannah blinked. Wealthy men didn't usually ask for waitresses' home addresses. But his tone wasn't flirtatious or threatening. If anything, it was desperate. Against her better judgment, she scribbled her address on a napkin and handed it over. He nodded, said nothing more, and finished his meal in silence. When he left, he dropped a $100 tip on a $60 tab. Chapter 4. The Knock. That night, Hannah lay awake long after her mother had fallen asleep. She couldn't stop thinking about the man, about the ring, about the way his face had shifted when she said her mother's name. She got up quietly and crept in her mother's room. Margaret lay curled on her side beneath a threadbare blanket, her breathing shallow. Hannah opened the bedside drawer and pulled out the old ring box. There it was, the same silver band, the same swirling design. Her fingers trembled as she closed the box. The next morning, as snow piled high against the windows, a knock echoed through the house. Hannah pulled on sweatpants and a faded Syracuse University hoodie and peered through the peephole. It was him, the man from the Argent, standing on their weather-beaten porch in a black overcoat, snow dusting his shoulders. She threw open the door. What are you doing here? He didn't smile. My name is Daniel Mercer. May I come in? Her mind reeled. Daniel Mercer? The tech mogul whose empire stretched from Wall Street to Silicon Valley? He was worth billions. His face graced magazine covers, and he was standing on her porch like a man waiting for judgment. Why? She asked. I need to see your mother. Her heart twisted. She's resting. She's sick. Why do you want? Please. His voice cracked on the word. Against every instinct, she stepped aside. Chapter 5. Shattered. Daniel's polished shoes crossed their worn threshold. The house smelled faintly of medicine and cold air. Margaret was propped up on pillows in the living room, her face pale, her hair thinner than it had ever been. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him. Daniel, she whispered, her voice breaking. He staggered as if someone had struck him. Maggie, my God. Hannah stared, her pulse roaring in her ears. You know each other? Daniel's eyes never left Margaret's. Who is she? He asked, nodding toward Hannah, his voice raw. Margaret's lips trembled. She's your daughter. The words detonated in the room. Hannah's knees buckled. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. What? She choked out. Mom, what are you talking about? Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears. I was pregnant when you left, she told Daniel. I didn't tell you. I couldn't. You were building your company, your empire. And I was just someone you used to know. Daniel sank into a chair, his hands shaking. You raised her alone, he murmured, devastated. Hannah's voice broke. You my father? Neither of them answered. They didn't need to. Anger surged through her, hot and cutting. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, turning on Margaret. I wanted to protect you, her mother said weakly. I didn't want you to feel abandoned. Daniel stood abruptly. I need to think. Before Hannah could stop him, he left. Chapter 6. The Return. Days passed in a haze. Hannah went to work, her smile a hollow echo of what it used to be. She saw Daniel's ring every time she closed her eyes. Then, on a gray Friday morning, a black SUV parked in front of their house. Daniel stepped out. Alone. Hannah opened the door, arms crossed. What do you want now? He lifted his hands in surrender. I owe you both an apology. She hesitated, then let him in. Margaret sat, wrapped in blankets, watching them both carefully. Daniel knelt beside her. I was a fool, he said. I walked away because I thought success mattered more than anything. I didn't realize I was leaving behind everything that actually mattered. He turned to Hannah. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make it right. She glared at him. After 24 years, I don't deserve anything from you, he admitted, but I'm asking for a chance. Chapter 7. Healing. Daniel pulled a faded photograph from his coat. He and Margaret, laughing together at a county fair. The same ring on her finger. I never stopped loving you, he told Margaret softly. I just didn't know how to stay. Tears slid down her cheeks. Hannah's anger cracked. Then Daniel handed them a hospital referral. I've arranged for you to see one of the best oncologists in New York City, he said. Private care. It's covered. And your medical bills, they're gone. Hannah's mouth dropped open. What? I'm not buying forgiveness, he said. I'm trying to fix what I broke. Margaret took his hand. I forgive you. Hannah sat slowly on the couch. I don't know you, she whispered. But I want to. Daniel's arms trembled as he pulled her into a hug. I'm so sorry, Hannah. I'll spend every day earning your trust. Chapter 8. Spring. Months later, as spring bloomed across Syracuse, Margaret's health improved. They moved into a warm house overlooking Jamesville Lake. Hannah quit the Argent and re-enrolled in college. They weren't perfect, but they were family. One evening, Hannah sat on the porch, Daniel's ring in her hand. It brought me back to you, he had said when he gave it to her. She smiled, tracing the swirls. Her life had changed with a single act of noticing. Kindness had carried her through the hardest years. But love was what held her steady now.